But let's start with MS Now White House reporter Jake Traylor. Jake, thanks for joining us, of course. The president spoke to two media outlets just a short time ago about Iran. What more are we hearing about the administration today and about those talks in particular?
Yeah, well, just seconds ago, right behind me, our eagle-eyed producer, Emily Hung, spotted what appears to be Vice President Vance's motorcade arriving to the White House. That is coming as some of the reports that you mentioned are speaking of today, that the president is meeting with some of his top aides and allies to consider and talk about what the military options are with Iran, to consider potentially resuming military action after this multiple weeks kind of shaky ceasefire has held. We also heard from the president earlier this morning on Truth Social, posting a photo of Iran with embedded over it an American flag with the caption reading United States of the Middle East with a question mark. So the president clearly toying there, potentially joking, but also, of course, this is quite the serious moment, speaking about, in some way insinuating that the United States would be involved in Iran. That's heavily weighted as the consideration is taking place in real time about the resuming of military action. I was just speaking with the White House official who said that yesterday and as well as today, there are active conversations inside of the Oval Office between President Trump and his top aides and allies about this resuming of military operation in Iran. There are a lot of details to parse out and sides to be weighed here, but this is something that is ongoing. I'll note, too, that the president announced yesterday, despite his son getting married this weekend, he decided to stay back in Washington, D.C. for what he referred to as pertinent matters. Secretary Rubio in India was asked about where the current state of affairs lies with the United States and Iran. Take a listen to what he said earlier today.
I don't have news for you at this very moment, but there might be some news a little later today. There may not be. I hope there will be, but I'm not sure yet. The question is about the Iranian issue, and as I said, there's been some progress done, some progress made. Even as I speak to you now, there's some work being done. There is a chance that whether it's later today, tomorrow, in a couple days, we may have something to say. But this issue needs to be solved, as the president has said, one way or the other. Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. The straits need to be opened without tolls. They need to turn over their enriched uranium. They need to turn over their highly enriched uranium.
Now, remember, President Trump on Monday said he was holding off on what was a planned attack on Iran on Tuesday, but he noted in that Truth Social post that he has prepared his military operations to be ready to go on, quote, a moment's notice.
Of course, we'll see what happens. Jake Traylor, thank you so much for that report. Let's bring in Peter Baker, MS Now contributor and chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, and Mark Polymeropoulos, former senior intelligence officer at the CIA and MS Now national security and intelligence analyst. Thank you guys both for joining us. So, Peter, let's start with you. So much back and forth just today alone. But how do you interpret these two messages from President Trump on Iran? Again, he told CBS the U.S. is getting closer, a lot closer, to that point, to a deal, while telling Axios it's 50-50 on a deal or renewed military action. So which do you think is more likely to happen here?
Well, look, we've seen this movie before, right? Multiple times in the last 2 or 3 months, we have heard the president say, we have a deal. We're almost at a deal. A deal is imminent. We're right there. They've already agreed to do the things I've asked them to do, all of which turned out not to be the case. This time may be different. We'll see. We shouldn't rule it out. At some point, it could be, but we should be cautious about assuming anything until something is actually in writing and sealed. Because I mean, the dance of the negotiators is part public and part private, right? If you're sending messages in private, you may not be saying them in public, and the things you say in public may be intended to influence the conversations you're having in private.
And I think it's hard for people at home to even keep up with so much back and forth. But let me ask, President Trump is skipping his son Don Jr.'s wedding in the Bahamas today to remain in D.C. When asked on Thursday about his attendance, the president said, quote, "This is not good timing for me. I have a thing called Iran." So, Mark, based on your intelligence experience, of course, what does this signal to you about what may be going on inside the White House today?
So, Brett, I think it's the notion of, can the military, with a renewed campaign, can they actually do anything to affect change in Iranian behavior? And I think that's the question that CENTCOM, Central Command, is struggling with. Assumingly, they're also briefing President Trump, too. What could we do? What military activity would actually get Iran to move, to get them to capitulate? I'm not sure there's a silver bullet there. And so now you're at the point where, and I think even over the last, 3 or 4 hours, there's been a flurry of activity, particularly on social media, which suggests that a deal might be imminent. And that might just be a reflection of this is just frankly, the best thing that can come about, which a lot of us think was a flawed strategy to begin with. One of the things that's quite interesting, and Peter will have a good take on this. If there is a deal, President Trump is really going to face withering criticism, particularly from the right, that this looks like essentially an Obama deal, the JCPOA 2.0. Nothing all that much better. And already you see people in social media on the right really criticizing Trump for even considering over the next several hours taking this deal. But one quick point, Britt, and as a former intelligence officer, it's also really important to say, I don't know what he's going to do. Trump sometimes takes one tack, sometimes takes another. We'll find out when it happens, but it's very hard to be predictive in terms of this president and his behavior.
Absolutely. Peter, I'm going to toss it back to you really quickly. All this comes amid multiple reports. Trump is weighing new strikes against Iran. So what factors is the White House considering, and who's representing the U.S. in these discussions between Pakistan and Iran's foreign minister?
Well, I think you're right to ask what that might look like. And to Mark's point, I think that they have to confront the notion that further airstrikes by themselves may not shift the overall equation, right? Obviously, Iran doesn't want to be bombed again. Obviously, the bombing did devastating damage in a lot of ways, but it didn't fundamentally change the Iranian regime, right? It got rid of one Ayatollah in favor of his son. The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, still in charge. The airstrikes got rid of some ballistic missiles, but intelligence reports that have been aired in the media have suggested that still the vast majority of ballistic missiles are, still available to Iran. So in other words, regime change and changing strategy on the part of an enemy from the air has its limits, history suggests. So, simply returning to the same kind of bombardment we had before, devastating as it might be, may not change the Iranian calculation. The Iranians are looking at our politics. They're looking at what's happening here at home, and they see a president heading into Memorial Day weekend with gas prices that are too high for summer travelers, with Republicans on the Hill now balking, not only at his ballroom and his fund for his allies, but even potentially over the war. They had to postpone these votes on, whether to stop the war because they're worried they don't have the votes. And the president has now alienated enough Republicans in the Senate that he's made his position even harder. Iran sees that. They know that. They may be calculating that they can wait him out.
I want to talk about another major story that made headlines yesterday. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard announcing her resignation due to her husband's recent cancer diagnosis. So, Mark, how could this sudden shakeup really affect not just the 18 agencies Gabbard was overseeing, but the CIA's role in particular in monitoring what's happening in Iran right now?
Well, Britt, first let's start with the notion of Tulsi resigning. I think this was long expected. If you lose the president's ear, if you lose access, that's kind of intelligence chief 101 in Washington. You have to leave. There was an incredible event, many years ago. Jim Woolsey was President Clinton's CIA director. A small plane crashed on the White House lawn, and the joke in Washington was Woolsey trying to get in to see President Clinton. He didn't have that access either. So Tulsi leaving is something that, whether you're from the right or the left, I think was certainly expected. But the question you raised is a very good one. Does this affect CIA's intelligence gathering, human intelligence? That's when we run spies penetrating foreign governments. The answer is no. Same thing for the National Security Agency. That's signals intelligence collection. And one of the things that's going to be really interesting is as Aaron Lucas, the deputy now, takes over in an acting capacity, what becomes of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, an entity that was created in the reforms after September 11th. But there's a lot of people, especially people on the Hill, like Senator Tom Cotton, the chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, who wants to see a much diminished role of the DNI. So I don't think this really has an effect on national security, but it certainly was time for Tulsi to go because she lost the ear of the president, and that's not a tenable situation.
Now, Mark, you touched on this a little bit, but Peter, I want to dive deeper here. Your colleagues at the Times write, Gabbard's departure will bring an end to her rocky tenure, during which she had been largely sidelined by the White House on significant national security issues, including military operations in Iran and Venezuela. How would you sum up her time as the director of national intelligence? And we talked about this a little bit, but tell us more about her deputy, Aaron Lucas, who has been tapped now by President Trump to serve as acting NID.
Yeah, I think the thing about her departure, as Mark was just alluding to, is the idea that inside Trump's orbit, the people who have urged restraint, right, the restrainers, as some people call them, when it comes to military action overseas, are losing out. Right, the people who have urged him to be more kinetic, to be more militaristic, to use the military in ways that he had told us he was not going to do during his campaigns, they're the ones on the ascendant. So she had specifically said time and time again that going to war with Iran was a big mistake. She said it even while she was DNI last year. That it would be, that warmongers are trying to get the president to do something he shouldn't do. So once you've said that, and once he's clearly gone the other direction, you don't have much of an option there. I think that to the point of her successor, I think to Mark's point, I think that now that position has been so diminished in terms of its influence within the administration that Aaron Lucas may not have much of a role to play. He doesn't have the political posture that Tulsi Gabbard had. Remember, Tulsi Gabbard ran for president. She was a Democrat who switched over to Trump's side, so he liked that visual, that optic, to be able to say, here's somebody from the other side who thinks I'm right. This guy, Aaron Lucas, doesn't fit into that kind of category. He'll sit in the room, but it's hard to know if he has much influence.
All right, Peter Baker and Mark Polymeropoulos, thank you so much for your time today.